So we turn today to the contemporary debate about the merits of utilitarianism, a debate that Rachel's focuses on in chapter 8 of the Elements of Moral Philosophy. It's an interesting feature of this debate that you get really quite strong opinions on both sides, right? You get, on the one side, people who are basically convinced that some form of utilitarianism has to be right. And on the other side, you get people who think that it's a terribly immoral view and it just can't be right. So, one thing to do is to try to explain that phenomenon a little more as a way of sort of leading into the debate. So you might ask first, why is it that people who are sort of pro-utilitarian think utilitarianism has to be right? Here we can look again at this three-part definition of utilitarianism that we had before, which we got on a PowerPoint. There we go. Don't need to write it down again because you've got it somewhere else, but it's worth bearing in mind. Look, as many contemporary philosophers, and in particular many contemporary utilitarians see it, it's consequentialism that's the core of the utilitarian view. And as they see it, consequentialism is a view that it would be just irrational to reject. I mean, what they say is, look, if you've got two alternatives and you say, one of them has less good consequences than the other one, right? Why would it be rational or sensible to do the thing that has the less good consequences when you have open to you to do the thing that has the better consequences? So, to them, consequentialism seems like a kind of principle of rationality. So that's a quick sketch of sort of one side of the debate. So what motivates those on the other side then? Well, many of those on the other side of the debate are impressed by a wealth of apparent counterexamples to utilitarianism. They're impressed, that is, by the existence of lots of situations where, as it seems to them, utilitarianism systematically gives morally wrong guidance. And what they're inclined to do is trust their moral intuitions, moral common sense or whatever about these situations and use that as a basis on which to reject consequentialism and utilitarianism. The way into the debate, really, is to look at some of these problem cases, some of these situations that are supposed to provide problems for counterexamples to utilitarianism. We'll work with a small subset of them. Rachel's does something similar. There are a lot out there in the literature. I was at a conference a while ago where someone referred to a paper that, or it might have been a paper, might have been a book probably, that kind of collected these, and according to this person I ran into, there are like at least 100 of these sort of going around in the literature. But we don't need 100, right? We'll basically work with 2 of them. Right? So these problem cases have a common structure, right? And let's start out with a sort of further specification of what that structure amounts to. Again, we could pop over to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so that's the general structure. Let's now do a couple of examples, right? Rachel's has, I mean, 3 such cases actually in section 8.3. We'll just focus on 2 of them, one of which I'll do a slightly different version, but it'll be the same basic idea. Start with the one that he gets from the philosopher H.J. McCluskey. This is hypothetical problem case first described by McCluskey in an article in a philosophy journal published in 1965. The description of the case is to be found quoted starting at the bottom of page 111. So McCluskey writes, suppose a utilitarian were visiting an area in which there was racial strife, and that, during his visit, a Negro rapes a white woman, and that race riots occur as a result of the crime. Suppose, too, that our utilitarian is in the area of the crime when it is committed, such that his testimony would bring about the conviction of whomever he accuses. If he knows that a quick arrest will stop the riots and lynchings, surely, as a utilitarian, he must conclude that he has a duty to bear false witness in order to bring about the punishment of an innocent person. So you see the idea here, right? So this is the Jim Crow South, the pre-civil rights South. Yeah. There's been a rape of a white woman by a black man, and there are riots and lynchings going on. You are to imagine yourself as someone who has credibility with the police. You probably better imagine that you're a white male, right? And as the case is described, you are in the following position. I mean, you have no evidence, no real reason to suspect any particular person of being guilty, but you also believe that by accusing a particular black male of being the rapist, you can stop the riots and lynchings. Right? And then, look, this is how it's supposed to go, right? On the one hand, A, utilitarianism tells you should do that, right? Because it'll have better consequences. But on the other hand, B, you could put this various ways, our moral common sense, our ordinary moral consciousness, our moral intuitions tell us that would be wrong. It's wrong to bear false witness against innocent people. Hence, utilitarianism conflicts with our moral common sense. So utilitarianism should be rejected. Okay? So does everyone get how that case is supposed to work? All right. Do a second case. This is a slightly different version of a case that Rachel's does. Same basic idea. Suppose it's like this. Suppose you have promised to meet person A for lunch. On the way to do so, you meet person B. Person B invites you for lunch. Can't have lunch with both of them because they don't get along. And you can't cancel the lunch with person A because person A is not answering their cell phone. You know, they're for some reason inaccessible. Question is, what should you do? So you do a little calculation. You take into account how much extra happiness you would get by going to lunch with person B rather than person A. And you take into account person A's happiness, and you take into account person B's happiness. And you do your little utilitarian sum, and you decide that there'll be slightly greater overall happiness if you break the promise and go to lunch with person B, rather than keeping the promise and going to lunch with person A. So the critic says, then, again, right, according to utilitarianism, the right thing to do is break the promise and have lunch with person B. But, says the critic, according to our moral common sense, that's wrong. You can't break a promise just because breaking a promise would have slightly better consequences than keeping it. So again, utilitarianism conflicts with our moral common sense, so utilitarianism should be rejected. Now let me be clear about a couple of features of this case, about the reasoning you're supposed to go through, okay? It's a way of sort of reminding you what utilitarian reasoning consists of here, right? So it's not that what you do is decide, oh, I'd rather go to lunch with person B, so I'll go to lunch with person B, right? That wouldn't be utilitarian reasoning. That would just consider you, right? That wouldn't consider everyone, so you wouldn't be doing a proper utilitarian calculation. Nor is it the case that what you do is you say, well, you know, person B and I prefer that I go to lunch with person B, only person A prefers that I go to lunch with person A, so it's 2 to 1, so I go to lunch with person B. That's taking a vote, right? And one of the things that we pointed out before was that utilitarianism is not the same as taking a vote. It doesn't tell you always to do what vote taking would tell you to do. So look, the reasoning, for it to be proper utilitarian reasoning, it has to involve sort of adding up the different levels of happiness for each person under the two scenarios and deciding that the overall level of happiness will be slightly greater if you break the promise and go to lunch with person B rather than if you keep the promise and go to lunch with person A. Right? So that's the reasoning involved. But look, the critic's claim is still it would be wrong to do so, right? Then, you know, a critic may admit there may be some cases where it would be okay to break a promise, but it's not okay to break a promise merely because by breaking a promise you bring about slightly more happiness than you would by keeping. All right, so what we have here then are two specific problem cases. Yeah? Critics of utilitarianism, though, don't sort of just think there are these very specific cases. What they think is that what these specific cases do is they reveal some general defect in utilitarianism. They reveal some way in which utilitarianism is sort of systematically blind to some important kind of moral consideration. We go to the next PowerPoint, and then I've got a way of sort of specifying what those revealed systematic defects are. You write down the PowerPoint, and I'll say a little more about it. Okay, so let me say a little more about what the defects are that these cases are supposed to reveal. I mean, I've given them names there, right? But let me spell that out a little further. So look, one standard diagnosis of what cases like the McCluskey case, the punishing the innocent case, reveal to be systematically wrong with utilitarianism is the diagnosis. They reveal that utilitarianism systematically fails to take individual rights seriously. So the person who says this will say, look, the reason you can't punish that innocent person is that to do so would be to violate that innocent person's rights. Yeah? And the reason utilitarianism, as the critic sees it, gets it wrong about cases like this is that utilitarianism doesn't take seriously enough, doesn't give sufficient weight to such individual rights. So that's the diagnosis about, the first case. Right? Diagnosis about the second case, the promise-breaking case, is utilitarianism is sort of systematically blind to the moral importance of considerations about the past. Right? I mean, utilitarianism is a consequentialist view. It's committed to the idea that the only things that are morally important are facts about the present and future. But, says the critic, as in this case involving promises, we ordinarily think that facts about the past have intrinsic moral significance. We think the fact that you promised is something that carries weight of itself. So the reason, says the critic, the utilitarian gets it wrong here is the utilitarian doesn't take seriously the moral significance of such facts about the past. Or, to use the exact terminology I use there, the utilitarian doesn't take seriously backward-looking reasons. So then there are a couple of these problem cases. Like I said, I mean, there are many, many more that we could do, but we got enough to be getting on with. So that's sort of the first move in the debate. But it's only the first move, right? I mean, like any philosopher who is sort of seriously committed to a theory, right? The person committed to utilitarianism isn't going to give up at the first sign that someone on the other side has a criticism to make, right? Instead, what the supporter of utilitarianism will do will be in some way to attempt to respond to and undermine the force of that criticism. And Rachels distinguishes three different ways that utilitarians standardly respond to objections, problems, criticisms of this form. And we can start out by sort of sketching in the abstract the way those defenses, as he calls them, work. Then we can explore the merits, the plausibility of each of these defenses in considerably more detail. So, pop over the PowerPoint again. He distinguishes three defenses of utilitarianism. They used to actually, in older editions, they used to be called lines of defense of utilitarianism. The term defense used in this way is, I think it's a chess term, right? And if you may have gathered from the preface, the junior Rachels is a chess grandmaster, so I think that's why he likes to use that terminology. Anyway, so three defenses of utilitarianism. So the first one is to deny that utilitarianism really conflicts with moral common sense. Second defense is to accept that the original version of utilitarianism, which we now call act utilitarianism, does conflict with moral common sense, but then modify the view, change to a new version of the view called Rule-Utilitarianism, and thereby eliminate the conflict. And the third defense is to, agree that there's a conflict, but to hold that when there is such a conflict, you should accept utilitarianism rather than moral common sense. Alright, so what we're going to do now then is explore each of these lines of defense in considerably more detail. Basically, as Rachel's does, he does this in section 8.5 of the Elements of Moral Philosophy, basically focusing on the McCluskey case, the case of, bearing false witness against the innocent person, as our primary example. So consider first the first line of defense, right? Denying that utilitarianism and moral common sense really conflict. How would this go in that McCluskey case? Well, I'll read you what Rachel says in a sec, but look, here's the idea. The idea is you say, look, if you think realistically and take into account, long-term as well as short-term consequences, it's not very likely that bearing false witness against this innocent person will have good results. I mean, after all, you might very well not be able to get away with a lie, and even if you get away with a lie for the short term, someone's very liable to find out, or the original rapist might attack again, and then you'll just have made things worse by meddling in this way. So, contrary to the initial setup of the case, in fact, utilitarianism and moral common sense don't disagree here. They both agree that you shouldn't bear false witness against the innocent person. Here's Rachel's saying that. This is it's under the heading the first defense, denying that the consequences would be good. Starting at the very top of 117, I'll read you the first paragraph there, just because that's the paragraph that sort of nicely reminds you about the basic structure of all these problem cases, and then it's the next paragraph that really fleshes out the first line of defense with respect to this McCluskey case. So Rachel's right. The first defense says that the anti-utilitarian arguments make unrealistic assumptions. Most of these arguments share a common strategy. The critic describes a case and then says that utilitarianism requires a certain action, bearing false witness, violating someone's rights, and so on. But the critic says these actions are obviously immoral. Therefore, utilitarianism is incorrect. But this strategy succeeds only if we agree that the actions described really would have the best consequences. And why should we agree with that? In the real world, lying under oath does not have good consequences. Suppose in the case described by McCluskey, the utilitarian tried to incriminate the innocent man in order to stop the riots. He probably would not succeed. His lie might be found out, and then the situation would be even worse than before. Even if the lie succeeded, the real culprit would remain at large and might commit more crimes. Also, if the guilty party were caught later on, which is always possible, the liar would be in deep trouble, and confidence in the criminal justice system would erode. The moral is that although one might think one can bring about the best consequences by such behavior, one cannot be certain of it. In fact, experience teaches the opposite. Utility is not served by framing innocent people. Okay, so that's how that first line of defense goes with respect to the McCluskey case. So what does Rachel think of it? Does he think it's good? Do you think this is a good way to defend utilitarianism on balance? Yes, no? Haven't read that bit yet?
Rachel thinks that it's a weak defense.
He does think it's a weak defense. You are quite right, yes. Yes, he does. If you look skip a paragraph, look at the paragraph beginning at the bottom of page 117. He tells you why he doesn't think it's very good. Right? He says, so that is the first defense. How effective is it? Unfortunately, it contains more bluster than substance. While it is true that most acts of false witness and the like have bad consequences, it cannot be said that all such acts have bad consequences. At least once in a while, one can bring about a good result by doing something repugnant to moral common sense. Therefore, in at least some real-life cases, utilitarianism will conflict with common sense. Moreover, even if the anti-utilitarian arguments had to rely exclusively on fictitious examples, those arguments would nevertheless retain their power. For showing that utilitarianism has unacceptable consequences in hypothetical cases is a valid way of critiquing it. The first defense, then, is weak. So then, there Rachel says, what's wrong with this? I mean, he has a sort of two-part criticism, right, of this first line of defense. He says, look, first, I mean, all right, maybe in many real-world cases, utilitarianism and moral common sense will agree. But there'll be at least some real-world cases where you can bring about good results by doing intuitively morally dubious things like bearing false witness against an innocent person. Right? Then second, he says, even if that were true of no real-life cases, you can still make it true of a hypothetical case. I mean, because all you do there is you stipulate, you build into your hypothetical case what you need to ensure there's a conflict. Right? So if you're doing a, purely hypothetical version of the McCluskey case, you can just stipulate, you will succeed in incriminating the innocent person, the original rapist will never lie, never attack again, etc. Right? And if you, as you can when it's a purely hypothetical case, build all those stipulations in, then you can sort of guarantee that the best consequences from a utilitarian point of view will be brought about by bearing false witness against an innocent person. But Rachels wants to insist, intuitively that still seems wrong, so that's enough to show that utilitarianism really does conflict with moral common sense. Yes?
Races aside and all that, and arguments aside, in McCluskey's example, what would a utilitarian do? Would they say that, oh no, it's fine, that they don't conflict, or would they go ahead and, would they testify against an innocent person or whatever? Would they or would they not?
Well, I mean, look, in a way, that's just the point that we're asking about, right? And in a way, there's not a... I mean, the existence of this debate shows that there's sort of not a simple, straightforward answer, right? Because, look, I mean, of course, the critic says, yeah, utilitarianism commits you to doing that, right? But then, if you go with this first line of defense, you deny that. In a different way, as we'll see in a sec, if you go with the second line of defense, you deny it too. But if you take the third line of defense, you say, yeah, you would convict an innocent person, and actually that's the right thing to do, right? I mean, so I mean, I guess it's not as if it's not as if there's some clear starting definition of utilitarianism which tells you which way to go. Rather, the utilitarian in this debate has a number of options that may push in different directions, and that's sort of just what we're exploring. Good. All right. I think Rachels is a little hard on the first line of defense, actually. And I may come back to that because I think when you get to the third line of defense, you see that some of what Rachel says in being rather more sympathetic to the third line of defense may be a little inconsistent with some of what he says in being very harsh on the first line of defense. Maybe we'll come back. Okay. Turn now, though, to the second line of defense, the idea that you move from act to rule utilitarianism, and that solves the problem. This second line of defense, this move, requires a good deal more articulation. I mean, so it's a somewhat complicated matter, this. In particular, there are sort of three things we got to do in working through this proposal, working through the idea of responding to criticisms by reformulating utilitarianism as rule utilitarianism. We could pop to the PowerPoint at this point. So it's sort of 3 stages in the discussion, the 3 things you got to do, right? First thing you got to do is just sort of understand how these different utilitarian approaches are defined. Then second, what you got to do is, understand how it's supposed to help. Understand why it's supposed to be that when you move from act to rule utilitarianism, you eliminate the problems, eliminate the conflict between utilitarianism and moral common sense. Then, third and finally, you've got to see why it doesn't work. You've got to understand the central and to mine, I think many other people's minds, decisive argument against rule utilitarianism. All right, so begin with the first of these 3 stages then. I'll give you something for your notes in a sec, but let me try and characterize it first. So look, act utilitarianism is the view we've been considering so far, right? Unless you specify otherwise, utilitarianism is act utilitarianism. So the act utilitarian view is just that, to decide whether an action's right, you look and see whether it has better consequences than any other alternative. If it does, it's right. If not, it's not. Right? That's all familiar enough. I mean, that's, that's when we're being careful, we define that, as consequentialism plus hedonism plus an equality principle, but we're going to define it in a somewhat simpler form here to bring out the contrast with rule utilitarianism. So it's rule utilitarianism that takes a little more getting your head around. Right? So look, the rule utilitarian idea is that action evaluation is it's indirect. So first, if you're a rule utilitarian, what you've got to do is you've got to specify what the right system of rules is. Right? And you do that by asking a utilitarian question. Right? What you're supposed to ask is, what's the set of rules such that if people followed it, they'd be happier than they would if they followed any other set? So you've got this kind of society-wide utilitarian test that's supposed to determine what the correct set of rules is. Yeah? Then the idea is, when you're evaluating the rightness or wrongness of individual actions, you don't look at the consequences of those individual actions at all. Instead, you just refer them to the rules. So if the rules say they're right, they're right. If not, then they're not. And that's the way, and I'll bring this out, I think it's on a PowerPoint, but that's the way in which rule utilitarianism involves evaluating actions indirectly rather than directly. Okay. So here's sort of a pair of definitions. Oh, hang on. A pair of definitions designed to bring out the contrast. So we can pop over to the PowerPoint. The only thing, there's one typo here. In the definition of rule utilitarianism, it should be set of rules, plural, not set of rules, singular. Okay? When you get, I think that's the only place other than in the title where the word rule occurs, and pluralize it. Okay? Okay, so it's worth explicitly bringing out the way in which act and rule utilitarianism differ as well, right? This is something I already referred to when I was giving you the initial characterization, but you know, the basic difference as standardly specified is in terms of directness or indirectness, or alternatively put, sort of the number of steps that are involved in evaluating actions, where act utilitarianism, it's sort of a single step, it's direct. By contrast, rule utilitarianism, it's two-step indirect. So we can pop over to the PowerPoint again there. All right, it's probably worth also sort of reinforcing this by reading the passage from Rachel's where he articulates the distinction here. So this is page 118. I'll start with the final sentence of the second paragraph. What feature of classical utilitarianism is causing the trouble? The trouble at some assumption is that each individual action should be evaluated by reference to the principle of utility. If on a certain occasion you're tempted to lie, classical utilitarianism says that whether it would be wrong depends on the consequences of telling that particular lie. Whether you should keep a particular promise depends on the consequences of keeping that particular promise, and so on for each of the examples we've considered. If what we care about is the consequences of particular actions, then we can always dream up circumstances in which a horrific action will have the best consequences. Therefore, the new version of utilitarianism modifies the theory so that individual actions are no longer judged by the principle of utility. Instead, we first ask what set of rules is optimal from a utilitarian viewpoint. In other words, what rules should we follow to maximize happiness? Individual acts are then judged right or wrong according to whether they are acceptable or unacceptable by these rules. This new version of the theory is called Rule-Utilitarianism, to distinguish it from the original theory, now commonly called Act-Utilitarianism. One more thing is worth being very explicit about here, right? So look, Rule-Utilitarianism is not just any moral theory that involves rules, right? There are lots of moral theories that involve rules that are not Rule-Utilitarianism. Rule-Utilitarianism is not the theory that says you should follow the moral rules laid down by God. It's not the theory that says you should follow the moral rules that are the product of a social contract. It's not the theory that says you should follow the moral rules that your society right now happens in general to adhere to. Right? All of those are theories that involve rules. None of them are Rule-Utilitarianism. To be Rule-Utilitarianism, it's not enough that your theory involve rules. It's absolutely crucial, right? It's a necessary part of it that the rules should be selected by a utilitarian test. So a theory is only Rule-Utilitarianism if it's the theory that actions are to be evaluated by the set of rules, which is such that if people followed it, they'd be happier than they would if they followed any other set. Right? Let's put that, another way, right? In Rule-Utilitarianism, what you've got is you've got a utilitarian test for what the correct set of rules is. Right? If you've got that, it's Rule-Utilitarianism. But if you've got some other test for the set of rules, be it a social contract test, a divine command theory test, what your society right now happens to believe test, that's a theory that has rules in it, but it ain't Rule-Utilitarianism. Okay? All right. So that's the first stage in the discussion of Rule-Utilitarianism, and that's probably a good place to pause.